3 days ago, the world underwent a silent, high-frequency initialization. On February 13th, 2026, Saturn, the planet of structure, the planet of moral action, crossed the 0-degree point of Aries. We do not call this a reset, because that would imply a return to a previous state, a nostalgic glance at a system that no longer exists. This is an ingress, a forward movement into the next layer of the machine. For the individual, this moment marks the transition from the Piscean gestation, where we saw our hidden enemies, felt the weight of collective sacrifice, and glimpsed the spiritual vision of our true desires. And Saturn moves into the Aries fire of aggressive fortification. In the time crisis philosophy, Saturn in its fall in Aries is the torque. It is the friction necessary for movement. It is the resistance that proves the presence of the gears. We are currently witnessing the next layer and potentially the birth of the body of the internet. If the 1990s gave the computer body a soul, the internet, then 2026 is giving that digital soul a more complex and intricate physical form through synthetic intelligence and autonomous robotics. We are ascending into a 3 to 5 year climb of technological hypervaluation, fueled by the Saturn-Uranus sextile in the elements of fire and air. To understand where we are going, you must look at the handshake of these planets throughout history. This journey is governed by a 14-year architectural loop, the body of a revolution. The infrastructure, the wires, the chips, is always conceived and agreed upon when Saturn is in Libra, the sign of the contract, the sign of the architect. Exactly 14 years later, a half a cycle, Saturn enters Aries and a soul animates that body. From 2009 through 2012, mainly while Saturn was in Libra, we saw the birth of the Bitcoin Genesis block, the body of decentralized ledgers, and we saw the optimization of deep learning, the hardware, and the GPU body. In 2026, we are now animating that 14-year-old body with the soul of artificial and synthetic intelligence. In 1996, Saturn was in Aries. It was forming a sextile to Uranus and Aquarius. This was the moment that the home computer, the body, was given a soul, the home internet. This standalone box became a connected node. In 2026, we now see the waning sextile, the back end of this transit, or the back end of this synodic cycle. As Saturn returns to Aries, and its sextiles Uranus and Gemini, this is the fulfillment of the vision. Or rather, it's the vision coming together. All the opportunities for the internet and for computers and for technology to take the next step are being opened right now. AI and synthetic intelligence are no longer tools you log into. They're becoming part of the very environment that you inhabit. The internet has found its own complex body. This journey culminates in the Taurus Enclosure in 2028, where Saturn enters the sign of the bank, where it will be testing every currency on Earth, and it will start to usher in a total digitalization of the ledger. This celestial pattern is the heartbeat of the Enclosure. I am going to take you through the last century and a half of Saturn and Taurus transits in order to show you a pattern of timing so embedded in our lives that you can almost set your watch to it. Let's get into it. So the story begins in the 1830s. The body of the telegraph revolution, the copper wires, the basic hardware, it was conceived and laid out while Saturn was in Libra from 1833 until 1835. This was the agreement phase where Gauss, Weber, and of course Morse built the physical recording devices. In May of 1845, Kronos, the electric soul, was in Aries. This was providing the spark, but the structural world didn't catch up until April of 1849, which is when Saturn finally made its ingress into Aries. Before 1849, the telegraph was still in formation. It was still being rolled out. But after 1849, after Saturn made its ingress into Aries, it became an institutional structure. The wires, the body, were finally animated by a soul, the electronic pulses. And Saturn entering Aries, while Pluto and Uranus were in Aries, gave structure to something at mass. With Saturn, Mars, Uranus, and Pluto all in Aries at the time, Saturn gave it structure, Uranus gave it popularity, Pluto brought it to the masses, and Mars expanded it rapidly. When Mars triggered Saturn, Uranus, and Pluto going through Aries in 1849, it brought the telegraph out to the masses. By the time Saturn reached Taurus in 1851, the telegraph became a commodity. Banks and railroads were using this new hardware enclosure in order to synchronize prices across continents. It was the birth of the global soul being managed by centralized hardware. So 1851 to 1853, we have Saturn in Taurus. Saturn was in Aries. Not only was the telegraph being expanded, but the gold rush was happening in California, and it was flooding the market with gold. Gold was becoming cheap, while silver itself was becoming expensive. People realized that their silver coins were worth more as metal than as money, so people started to hoard their silver. Preceded by a Mars square to Taurus, a trigger, in 1853, on February 21st, with Venus, the ruler of money and assets, and the natural ruler of Taurus, square to Saturn in Taurus, Congress passed the Coinage Act of 1853. They reduced the silver content of coins by 7%, a direct devaluation, and they stamped arrows on the coins in order to distinguish the ones that had less silver. The public accepted the arrowed coins because it was convenient, while the big banks siphoned 7% of the real silver, the hardware, out of circulation. By the time that the public realized that the arrows actually represented a loss of wealth, the banks had held all that metal. And this would be my warning for 2028, when we have digital money and CBDCs and other forms of currency and tokenization headed our way, where our assets are moved, where our currency is moved from paper, fiat, into numbers and digits trackable on a screen. Between 1881 and 1883, while Saturn was going through Taurus, we had the United States using greenbacks as the currency following the Civil War. It was debt-free sovereign credit. It was backed by the assets of the people, sort of like colonial script, and it was sort of the fulfillment of Ben Franklin's vision, which was to have a people who own their own wealth. But as you probably guessed, the banks weren't having it. They spent many years trying to pass laws, such as the Specie Resumption Act, which specie meaning coin, to resume the use of coins. This was in order to force the people back into the banking system. In 1881, as Saturn moved through Taurus, the government declared paper was as good as gold. Because the paper was stable, people stopped hoarding their gold and started to deposit it back into banks. As you can guess, once the banks held the physical gold, they contracted the money supply. This led to the Panic of '84 when Saturn was in Gemini and the individual was liquidated. And as you can guess, after Saturn's tour through Taurus, the banks were left with all the gold. Of course, Taurus is the natural ruler of the house of money, or Venus is the natural ruler and Taurus is the natural sign of the house of money. In the United States' house of cash and resources and assets, we have the planet Pluto. And on April 5th of 1933, we have Executive Order 6102. We have Uranus and Aries square to the United States' natal Pluto in their house of money, in their house of assets. We have Saturn and Uranus in a fire and air sextile aspect, just as we have coming up this year with Saturn and Uranus in a fire and air sign. Or we also have a trine from the transiting Saturn in 1933 that was exact with the United States' natal Saturn in the 10th house of banking as a system. And on April 5th, 1933, this was not a correction. This was a national identity theft. Because to understand the seizure of solid assets, we must look at this U.S. Sibley United States chart. As Mars was steadily approaching a square with the United States' ascendant, their identity, the state was seizing the hardware of the people, which was gold at $20 an ounce. People were forced to hand in their gold or else face penalties, as we know, and fines. But as soon as they got control of the gold, they repriced the gold to $35 an ounce. The average American, who makes up the identity of America, was stripped of their assets in order to save the centralized ledger. We are currently 90 years from this event. Using the Gann master cycle of 90 years, 1933, 2023, except in 2028, 29, Saturn will be trining Pluto in the second house of money. It will be occupying Taurus, the sign of banking, at a time when your currency and your assets could easily become numbers on a screen, as if they already are. Which brings us to the next leap in hardware, and ultimately the next leap in technology. We have to look at how ARPANET started, which was foundational to understanding how the internet came about in 1996. In 1950, Saturn was in Libra. You see the pattern here? Saturn's in Libra and we get hardware. We had the birth of the transistor and of the UNIVAC 1, which was the first commercial computer body. 14 years later, or a little over 14 years later, we have Saturn entering Aries in 1967. Saturn and Aries birthed the ARPANET. The microchips and the specialized hardware were the body. The packet switching protocol was the soul, thing that animated the network. This allowed the tracking and the tracing of digital footprints for the first time. You'll notice a pattern. We got new technology when Saturn was going through Aries, 1967. And then once Saturn spent 2 years in Taurus, it laid the foundation for another transformation and really another devaluing of the United States currency. On August 15th of 1971, Nixon closed the gold window. There is a grand trine when that happened between Mars, Saturn, and Uranus. Pluto was in conjunct the moon in Aquarius, the United States' moon. The soul of the dollar was moved from metal into information. This was the spark of a 55-year period of debt-fueled expansion. In order to survive, you had to become a speculator. We are now quite literally at the dead end of this experiment. This is ushering us into the age of the internet, with Saturn once again in Libra in 1981, and between 1980 and 1982, we had the launch of the IBM PC and the TCP/IP. Quite literally, we had the body of the home computer. So the hardware was once again installed while Saturn was in Libra. In 1993, they had the release of the Mosaic web browser. This was really the start of home internet. Sort of like a few years back, in 2023, with ChatGPT, was really more of the start of AI. In 1996, when Saturn entered Aries, once again, we started to see the mainstreaming and the soul of the internet come into every person's home. Finally, there was animation to go with the hardware. With Saturn once again in Taurus in 1999, returning to the same degrees we will see in 2028, and with Mars in Scorpio opposing Saturn in Taurus, acting as a trigger in 1999, the system merged speculative investments with commercial banking deposits via the repeal Glass-Steagall. And at the same time, while Saturn was in Taurus, the euro was launched, which was basically a digital ghost currency for a while, as they didn't have any paper to go with it. And while Saturn was in Taurus, and with Saturn in Taurus in 1998, we had the Asian financial crisis. We had the long-term capital management bailout in the US. So tons of tests for the currency. And people were moving their money into the internet. Hence, we went and saw the .com, which we'll get to. By 2002, Saturn enters Gemini, and everybody who moved their money over to the internet and to the new tech that was coming available started to see declines in 2000, and ultimately by 2002, as Saturn made its way to the end of Gemini, the .com crash led to a 78% fall. And that is likely where we're headed with AI. Issues with the currency, it's starting to get mass appeal. It will become much more commoditized once we enter Taurus. And once Saturn enters Taurus, so now it's in Super Bowl commercials. Now we're seeing the leverage that can be built with it. And also we're seeing the fact that more and more of the mass population will start to adopt it. By 2028, that will likely occur. With Saturn and Aries in 2026, and Mars and Uranus becoming conjunct in Gemini, in trine to Pluto in Aquarius, the ruler of tech, Aquarius, not Pluto, but Pluto bringing this technology out into the mass population. This is a 2-year cycle of emerging AI into the mass market. You've got Mars in Gemini, communication and tech, and it's going to trigger a push for more complex tools. And while it may lead to more digitized money, it more likely cements AI as the new mass market staple. So the patterns are clear. The timing is precise. You can almost set your watch to the extractors. But now you have the timeline. And now we're installing the game plan. When Saturn enters Taurus, and as the dollar becomes more volatile come 2028, I'm assuming with the form of currency probably changing, as it always does by the end of Saturn's tour in Taurus, which will last a couple of years, that the masses will begin to seek safety and they will put their money back into the tech sector because AI is formidable and the new technology is creating very leveraged individuals, which is what I would encourage you to do. So more and more investors may put, or they may hedge their bets with AI, with big tech, and with some of these hardware companies that are mining the stuff. So I would expect more massive investments into tech stocks because you're going to want to hedge against the uncertainty of the changing currency. We're going to get CBDCs, or we're going to maintain cash, or we're going to go back on a gold standard. Probably not, but you never know. Will you actually see the gold if you do? Probably not. So once Saturn's in Taurus, this is where the masses will adopt the technology more. Just like, yes, in the early 90s, we saw the rise of home internet. And then by 96, it was being pushed out to a mass population. By the time Saturn was in Taurus, what we saw back then was people were putting more of their money into the internet and into computing, and rightfully so. But as more and more people got a computer, the computers become commoditized. The internet became a commodity that everybody was having. And so by the time Saturn gets into Gemini, there has to be a correction. There has to be some sort of leveling out of the market because AI itself and all of that stuff will be prevalent and everywhere. So again, once it's a commodity, it will no longer be as valuable. And then hence bring in the advertisers and maybe up the subscription prices. So this is the massive climb. People will move their money to tech, seeking safety amidst the chaos of the dollar, much like the internet before and the dot-com crash. AI will become a commodity. Workers will be replaced by AI at a massive scale, and this may be nulled by some sort of universal basic income, but your true sovereignty is going to lie in getting leveraged. You want to build skills, you want to start to own the hardware, and you want to get leverage. That means not having to rely on an API or a cloud, but to have the stuff on your own hardware and to be able to leverage this type of technology, make yourself money, and to be able to compete in a world where things are happening lightning fast. And people don't need a workforce because AI can do the things you used to do. Then 2031, Saturn and Uranus in Gemini. And with tech stocks and technology, at least the more recent developments having been commoditized, this is when the intelligence crisis will peak. And likely the tech overvaluation will have to be corrected, like I said. So be prepared for that. You want to start to own the medium while Saturn is in Taurus. Hard assets, leverage that you can depend on regardless of the currency. By 2030, you want to own the proper computing hardware, 24 gigs of RAM, the multiple terabytes, the things that you need in order to function outside of one of the major companies and their own APIs. Most people will be doing, right? Most people will be consuming. You're going to want to have land, you're going to want to have equity, whatever you can to continue to produce income when people are getting maybe at this point universal basic income just for being unemployed and just for saying, hey, we'd rather have AI do this and you stay at home. When the economy shifts to digital money and the wealth is consolidated, these are the only things that will likely allow you to stay leveraged. The system will give you digits on a screen. They will likely tax those digits to the microdecimal. This will likely make holding wealth a liability, and the only way to win a game of continuous leverage is to own the medium. My game plan would be simple. On an objective level, it's to own the hardware, get leveraged, secure your assets, and stay optimistic at a time when they're giving you tools that are going to make you extremely powerful as an individual if you use them as a producer and not as a consumer. And even though lots of people will likely trade their hard assets for digits on a screen, if you're following me, you're likely going to stay leveraged, stay ahead of the curve, and realize that you got a couple years to get this AI thing rolling. Pay very close attention to that Mars-Uranus conjunction that will be happening in July with that trine to Pluto. This could be a major issue for some sort of communication or technological event happening, and we'll look into that in other videos. As always, take your own side.